Sure thing. Thank you, Alfredo. So I guess to sort of steal a phrase from Stephen Covey, you've got to begin with the end in mind and think about what do you hope your business is going to become. So what I really mean by that at a kind of fundamental level is, are you thinking that you're going to build a company that's going to be kind of a legacy company and spit out, dividends over time? Or are you more interested in building a company that you're going to grow and sell? The other big question that you need to be asking yourself is, who do I plan to raise money from and where are they? So taking it from a US perspective, really the two fundamental choices that you have in terms of entity type are an LLC or a corporation. But in terms of jurisdiction, obviously there are 50 US states, right? And a quirk of the United States is that the laws of incorporation are unique to each state. They're not federal laws. So you've got to choose which state you're going to incorporate in. And the kind of gold standard is Delaware. And the principal reason that Delaware is the gold standard, or there are a few reasons, but one of them is that that's really where investors who, are sophisticated and regularly fund growth startups are most interested in investing, and that's because they're familiar with the legal frameworks that exist in Delaware. Then another reason is that in many respects, the whole ecosystem around startup funding is built around the Delaware Corporation. So if you want to make your life hard, if you're looking at least to be a growth startup in the United States, you would incorporate somewhere else. If you want to make your life easy, you would incorporate in Delaware. What I'm really getting at is, if you look at, for example, the form documents that are used when people are making investments, you're almost always going to take money on either a simple agreement for future equity, which is put out by Y Combinator, a convertible note, which the terms are more variable, the Series C.com investment documents, or the National Venture Capital Association investment documents. And all of those are built around the Delaware Corporation. And if you want to retrofit them for any other jurisdiction, you're going to have a hard time and you're going to spend a lot more money on legal fees. So that's kind of the technical reason why Delaware Corporation is a good choice for a growth startup. The most practical reason is that if you hope to take money from sophisticated United States investors, the types of people who typically invest in, Silicon Valley startups, they will almost universally insist that you be a Delaware corporation. So you don't actually, once you get to that point in the road, have much choice in the matter. Okay.
What about the different types of vehicles that you can incorporate either in Delaware or any other state in the US?
Sure thing. So yeah, I very briefly touched on the idea that the fundamental choice is between a corporation or a limited liability company. A limited liability company is a good choice potentially if you're looking to build a legacy company that's going to be profitable over time and pay you dividends. The reason for that is that it's what's called a pass-through under United States tax laws. So rather than the entity being taxed, the IRS views the entity as effectively not existing. That's if you elect for it to be taxed as a partnership. And the gains or the losses of the business instead flow through to its owners. And so if you're the owner of an LLC, you can either claim a loss, or you'll be, have a tax liability on the business's gain. So it's a good fit if it's a legacy company that's going to spit out dividends over time, and if you have a limited number of owners. It's also a reasonably good fit if you're not planning on issuing equity incentives to staff. If you hope to issue equity incentives to staff, a limited liability company is a very difficult vehicle to use to do that. It's just vastly more complicated than doing so in a corporation. And then, as I said, with the corp, the principal drivers are that that's the preference of the people who you probably want to take money from, and that the whole ecosystem of legal documentation kind of assumes that you will be a Delaware C-Corp. So you can do otherwise, but it's just going to be a lot harder when it comes to documenting your arrangements with your investors.
Okay. And with an LLC, let's say that you incorporated an LLC and then you realize that you needed a corp. You can then transform your LLC to a C-Corp.
Yeah, you certainly can do that, and it runs both ways. Delaware law allows you to switch from a corp to an LLC and vice versa. You also can, and it's worth mentioning because there might be people in the audience who have, already incorporated a business in another jurisdiction and are interested in moving to Delaware because their investors want to, put money into a Delaware corp. Many US states allow you to undertake what's called a statutory conversion, where your, for example, Florida limited liability company, by virtue of some paperwork, can become a Delaware corporation. It's much better to just choose the right entity to the extent that you can from the get-go, because you avoid a lot of difficulty, but that can certainly be done. And even if you've incorporated in a foreign jurisdiction, actually, it's possible to re-domicile certainly into Delaware. Not every US state permits that, but Delaware does permit that. It's then a question of whether the country you're currently domiciled in allows that. But even if it doesn't, there are alternative structures like share exchanges that you can use to effectively become a Delaware corporation, even though you're currently incorporated somewhere else in the world.
Okay. And for businesses in Latin America, mainly actual businesses in those countries would be a subsidiary of the LLC or a corp.
Yeah, that's definitely the typical approach, is that you would have the Delaware Corp is a holdco if you're operating outside of the US. If you're operating primarily in the US, the Delaware Corp would be your holdco and your operating co. You'd take money into the same entity that is, signing contracts, hiring staff, all of that. But if you were, say, typical arrangement in Latin America, if you're taking money in the US, would be have a Delaware corporation that raises money, doesn't have any direct activities, but it's the owner of, say, a Guatemalan Sociedad Anónima or, an entity anywhere else. And those entities, conduct business in those jurisdictions. The one kind of disadvantage of the C-Corp is that if you do, want to pay dividends out to your stockholders, you have a double taxation issue because you're going to have to flow profits up to the Delaware Corp from the operating co and then out to the stockholders. And you're going to have, potentially taxation at three levels: the local company, the Delaware holdco, and then the individual stockholder receiving the dividend. But if you're just looking to grow and sell, that will typically be a theoretical problem, because you're never going to pay a dividend, at least as between the Delaware holdco and the individual stockholder. It might be necessary for the operating company to move funds up to the Delaware holdco, to do business effectively.
Perfect. Coming back to local businesses, especially in Guatemala, Melissa, you can tell us more about the types of corporations that you can have in Guatemala, and Juan Pablo as well as the tax frame for Guatemala.
So first of all, just to quote the prior panel, please do break the rules. Just call us first, okay? Just that. Talking about doing business in Guatemala, I'm just going to talk about the basics. For example, the general rule for foreign investors is a foreign investor can wholly own any legal entity or real estate, with certain few exceptions, such as, for example, owning property alongside the country's border. That's only reserved for Guatemalans. Then we don't have any exchange currency or controls, meaning you can actually do an agreement or any transaction, in case you haven't noticed, in other currencies different from quetzales. So you can use US dollars or euros or whatever currency you want to use. So to sum up, our general rule for foreign investors is the equal treatment, meaning when you come to Guatemala, we are a very welcoming country. You will get the equal treatment as a Guatemalan, with certain exceptions and always complying with the rules. So now going to how can you do business in the country? We have basically 4 legal entities. The first one is the stock company, which is evidence, its equity is evidenced by shares, meaning the shareholders can prove their quality of shareholders by a title called shares. This is a very common legal entity because it's so easy to transfer the shares. So how can you transfer the shares? Actually, just by executing a purchase agreement endorsing the title, and then having it registered in the shareholders book of the company. The requirements for that kind of company is basically to have 2 or more shareholders, having it executed in a public deed, and it has a paid-in minimum capital of the equal of $26. So as you can see, it's very cheap to start a stock company in Guatemala. Then you have the limited liability company, which is not that commonly used because as opposed to the stock company, the partners, not shareholders, will evidence their capital contributions in the articles of association or incorporation of the company. Meaning, if you want to become a partner, you will have to amend the articles of incorporation and then having it registered at the mercantile registry, which is not impossible, but it requires a different process than just endorsing your shares. Although this entity is not as usually used as the stock company, for US corporations, that's a check in the box company. Why? Because if you have a limited liability company, you will only pay taxes at the partner's level, not at the company. So that's a benefit. Then you will have the foreign branch company, which is basically an extension of the foreign company in the country. It has several requirements, amongst which the most important are to have a duly incorporated and registered power of attorney with broad powers, and to have a bond of up to $50,000 US. The difference between this branch and a subsidiary is that the branch, the liable company will be the foreign company, as opposed to a subsidiary, it will be a local company, so that will be the liable for everything that the company does in the country. Finally, we have the entrepreneurship company, which was recently incorporated into our legal framework in 2018 by the Act for the Promotion of Entrepreneurship, and basically that differs from the other vehicles because it only requires 1 shareholder. It doesn't need to be incorporated in a public deed, so you don't need us. You can do it by yourself. But it has a limitation that you can only have a total annual income of 5 million quetzales. So if you exceed that amount per year, you have to switch your company and you will stop being an entrepreneurship company. I don't know if anyone has any questions so far to make it a little bit more interactive. No? No?
Yeah.
Okay. You have one? Oh, no. And then finally, very briefly, fintech. Since this is an innovation summit, fintech, we have a lot of fintech companies in the country. We don't have special regulations for fintech companies, so they have to apply for all the general obligations and duties as a regular company, but they have to pay special attention to anti-money laundering requirements. Why? Because under our anti-money laundering law, if you make a lot of transfer of funds in a systematic or substantial way, you will be deemed as an obligated person under that law, and therefore you will have to comply with certain requirements, such as appoint a compliance officer and record certain transactions you make. So that would, yeah, sure.
Do you think for a fintech that wants to operate in Guatemala, does using a local entity make the most sense, or would that be something you would discourage people from doing?
It would make sense, especially if you're thinking of going big and growing organically, very organized. You will need to have a legal entity. Yeah, that would be the advice. So, thank you.
Juan Pablo, you can maybe walk us through the tax system and the flow of funds between countries.
Okay. So I was trying to think about a way to explain the tax system in Guatemala, but it always became very boring. And given the hour and the need for coffee, I thought I better think about 3 principles that you need to bear in mind when you're doing taxes. The government is your silent partner always when you start thinking about it. So he's going to take 25% of your profits in Guatemala, and he's always going to ask for reporting. So the best way that you need to start thinking about, So you need to start thinking about taxes in the way that you're having a sitting partner, probably a lazy partner. He's not giving you funds, he's not giving you cash, he's not helping out. But you need to understand that he's going to take away a quarter of your profits. And it's actually, I was thinking about the other presentation before that were saying that you need to break all the rules. This is probably the one rule you don't want to break because it's the only break that's going to land you in jail. So, so we need to start thinking about this. So taxes in Guatemala are pretty simple. 25% silent partner not helping you. The other principle that I wanted to convey was taking on your idea of the flow of funds. We're thinking about innovation and we're thinking about ideas, and ideas are free to flow, but funds are not. Funds, goods, and services are not free to flow. So we need to understand that although we're thinking in ideas and we're dealing with ideas and we're moving systems through the internet likely, we still need to understand how this system is regulated locally. Now, there's one thing that I always like to point out, that the Commerce Code in Guatemala is 50 years old now. So it was issued in the 70s, and that it was old by that time. So you need to understand that you're dealing with systems that are not thought for this. They're thought for the mom and pop shop. They're thought about very simple procedures, very simple and complex ideas. And being the old guy here, I can say, I can use an example. It's like me trying to understand my kids. I will ground them first and then understand what they're doing. So when you're dealing with the taxes and you deal with the flow, think about the government as your dad. Think about how you need to understand, how you need to flow. Are you allowed to? Do you have permission? And if you don't, better get it. So that's kind of my 3 points.
Thanks, Juan Pablo. Juan, maybe this is from a point of an investor. What if something goes wrong? What if my investment goes wrong? What are my options? What can I do?
Okay, so in my opinion, this is pretty much the most fun part of an investment, at least on the side of a lawyer, maybe not for the investor, but what's actually going to happen if an investment goes wrong? And this is not only from a commercial point of view, this is also from the point of view of what happens if the legislation in a country actually changes and becomes some sort of hurtful to the investment that was made. That is why, even though I do agree with all of the panelists here, there is no specific protection for fintechs in Guatemala. That does not mean that fintech investments are not protected in our country. In fact, if we consider the situation that Henry was mentioning to us, which was that a Delaware company comes to Guatemala to, for example, invest in crypto or invest in fintech or whatever, in that case, there are still international protections that can be used by that fintech company in Guatemala. For example, between the United States, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, there is an international treaty called the CAFTA. The CAFTA actually has on Chapter 10 a provision which does protect international investment when it comes from the states. So once again, if we're relying on our specific case, which is basically bringing a Delaware corporation to invest in Guatemala, there are protections that can be taken. And even though, for example, here in Guatemala, we do not have a fintech law, such as there is in Mexico, or they have actually tried to make a couple in Panama, what we actually have is a protection from changing the legislation too much in a way that might hurt an investor. Up to this point, there are around 7 international cases against Guatemala, more specifically for the violation of investor protections. But that is actually a good indicator to invest in the country because Guatemala is part of several international institutions, such as, for example, the CIADI, which actually allows for the protection of international investment. Right now, around $50 million have been allocated to international investors for different treaty violations made by Guatemala, which actually considering against other countries in the world,
such as the Russian Federation, that's much less. They owe around $1.4 billion or something like that.
Thanks. Coming back to compliance, maybe we should approach the compliance side of fintech in Guatemala. What are the requirements? More taxes, the flow of funds, requirements for incorporating if it's an international company, a subsidiary here in Guatemala.
But my first, if I could give you an advice, is that the first part of your planning is get a good accountant. He's gonna have your back. You need to start to understand what sort of income you need to recognize in the country, what sort of expenses you can deduct. You need to be not disruptive in the way you process this from a paper trail standpoint of view.
Okay, maybe Melissa, from a regulations point of view, you mentioned that there's no regulation as such. Do you think something is coming in the coming years? Is it going to be regulated?
I don't see it, mainly because our regulator, actually they're a little reluctant into incorporating fintechs into the financial services as we know it. Speaking of banking, financial institutions, so I don't see it in the near future, but I think it will be very helpful for all the fintechs to have clear rules on what to do and how to do it. Because as of now, they're just trying to manage and to operate within the law, but with no clear boundaries.
Is that an advantage for fintechs as of now?
I think so, yeah, because that allows them to keep on growing and innovating and be more flexible. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, yeah.